George Floyd's brother, civil rights leaders, and law enforcement officials all testified at a House Judiciary Committee hearing Wednesday dealing with racial profiling, police brutality, and accountability. The hearing took place the day after George Floyd was laid to rest in Houston, and just over 2 weeks since his death at the hands of Minneapolis police sparked protests across the country and around the world. In an emotional opening statement, George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, talked about the pain he feels over his brother's death.
The man who took his life, who suffocated him for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he still called him sir as he begged for his life. I can't tell you the kind of pain you feel when you watch something like that. When you watch your big brother, who you looked up to your whole entire life, die begging for his mom. I'm tired. I'm tired of pain. Pain you feel when you watch something like that.
Briahna Joy Gray joins me now. She is a former national press secretary for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. Briahna, thanks very much for being with us. A number of politicians seem receptive at this moment to dealing with police reform, but disagree on what that looks like. At a time where there is such pain, there is such anger, how do we even start to have these uncomfortable conversations that need to be had right now?
Well, I think the first step for a lot of people is really recognizing the widespread enormity of the pain that was expressed so eloquently by George Floyd's brother in that clip, that this isn't an isolated call, that these are protests that have spread into geographically diverse areas, parts of the country that historically haven't seen these kinds of protests. The crowds have been racially diverse, economically diverse, and in some cases politically diverse. I think there's been an unexpected amount of agreement across the political divide about the fact that what happened to George Floyd was unconscionable. So that feels like a really powerful step. But I think something that's of concern to a lot of the protesters and people who are leading the movement is that that real deeply felt anguish could easily be co-opted and stymied by those who aren't really invested in more substantive reforms. And I think that's where you're getting some of the debate around the question of whether to use reform language or this newer language, newer to this movement at least, of defunding the police.
And what do you think some of the biggest roadblocks are to discussing these kinds of issues in a meaningful way?
Well, I think understanding the terms that we're using so that people aren't talking past each other is really key, right? So there are some people who hear calls to defund the police and they hear it as a call to lawlessness, or that people are somehow naive about the fact that, of course, crimes are committed and folks feel like there needs to be some kind of response. But what the call to defund the police is really about is to say that there are a number of factors that are that precipitate crime, and that if we were to fund the preventative things like education programs or mental health services or programs to help the homeless, then we wouldn't have police being asked to intervene in scenarios that ultimately are not safe for the populations that police are supposed to be protecting. Some instances aren't safe for the police themselves and don't actually go towards stopping these kinds of harms from being caused in the first place. So you have police who on average are responding about 21% of the time to instances that have to do with mental health resources, right? And this comes on the heels of decades of cutting back, defunding mental health services. You have statistics that show that increasing job opportunities for non-college educated men in particular can drop the incidence of crime by 10 to 20%. So the question becomes, why do we increasingly see overinflated police budgets that go up and up every year, budgets that in some cases, as in LA, are 50% of what's spent in the city, instead of rerouting those funds to the kinds of institutions like education and healthcare and mental health services that can actually prevent crimes from happening in the first place?
You know, these inequalities are so deeply rooted. And the fact is, when you look at the totality of the kind of racism that is embedded in our society, some might look at that and say it is nearly impossible to know where to begin. Policing is just one aspect, as you point out. Inequalities in education, others, housing, I mean, the list goes on and on. Do you think, however, the fact that we are in an election year actually presents an opportunity, because we have seen public opinion very overwhelmingly in this moment be with the protesters who are demonstrating in the streets? Public opinion is very clearly, overwhelmingly on the side of the people who are demonstrating for racial equality. Does that mean there may be a window here to actually make the kind of big systemic progress that I know you, that people like Senator Bernie Sanders, others have advocated for so long?
I think this is an opportunity. However, there are structural forces that are actively pushing against the forces in the street, the protesters, the tide of public opinion. And many of those are folks who we consider to be on our team, on our side of the political divide. So, for instance, you see gestures that many feel are largely empty. You see the members of Congress donning kente cloth graduation stoles and taking a knee. At the same time, the next day, taking to the podium and saying that they don't support the kinds of calls to defund the police the protesters actually want, right? You have many people saying that folks shouldn't be critical of Joe Biden and the fact that he has not embraced a lot of the reforms that are being asked for, because, in fact, the threat of Donald Trump is so much greater. We should all vote blue no matter who. And I don't think that folks have reckoned sufficiently with the extent to which the request for Democrats to fall in line and vote no matter who neuters our ability to call for the substantive reforms that this moment needs, not only because of the murder of George Floyd, but because of the economic conditions that prestaged all of this, because of the coronavirus, because of the mass unemployment that has disproportionately affected Black and brown Americans. And because of the fact that even before this crisis, Black and brown Americans regularly faced unemployment rates that were at times double that of white Americans. And as Bernie Sanders argued so persuasively throughout his entire campaign, we live at a period of income and wealth inequality that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, where 3 people have more wealth than the bottom 50% of human beings. And I think that you cannot divorce that kind of inequality. You can't divorce the fact that we don't have any leadership on either side of the aisle, at the top of the parties at least, who are willing to say, hey, it's a global pandemic. Healthcare is a human right. You should be able to be treated regardless of what your ability to pay is. There's no one who's willing to say, hey, we see an average of 1,000 people being killed by the police every year. We need something more than just reform. We need something more than language that can be so easily co-opted by people like Amazon and Nike, who treat their own Black and brown employees, both here and abroad, so abysmally. We need people who can actually speak truth to power and be authentic in their response, and not just engage in the kind of performativity that we've seen from so many so far. And I think that in an election year, this is a real opportunity for folks who really do want the turnout that they're going to need to win, who really do want the enthusiasm that we all know Donald Trump can muster from his base, to stand up and do the right thing in this moment.
All right, we are watching to see what actions come from this national conversation that we're having. Briahna Joy Gray, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Elaine.